Okay, welcome everyone to this worm composting class that we are very excited to offer. Before John begins, I'm going to read a quick land acknowledgement. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Shasta, Takelma, and Lagawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, as well as the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and Modoc Nation, who were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. The result of forced relocation and genocide is that Jackson County is no longer a population center for these specific tribal groups. As of the 2020 census, 4.6% of the population of Jackson County has some indigenous heritage. While this is more than twice the national average, it is a precipitous reduction from the pre-colonial 100%. We acknowledge that indigenous groups are too often relegated to the historical past when, in truth, indigenous peoples are essential members of the Jackson County community. We take this moment to recognize the indigenous peoples whose traditional homelands and hunting grounds are where residents of Jackson County live today. We encourage you to learn about the land you reside on and to join us in advocating for the inherent sovereignty of indigenous people. All right, and now to you, John.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. This is a hybrid presentation. I've not done this before. We're both a Zoom audience and an in-person audience. So we'll see how this goes. If you have troubles or problems or whatnot, go ahead and put something in the chat. And so with no further words, I'll start. And worms really don't eat dirt for food. They eat dirt to put something in their gizzard. Somebody in the in-person audience said that they thought chickens had gizzards. Well, worms do too. Okay, so today we're going to talk about worm composting, or rather, how worms help you compost kitchen scraps. We're going to talk about which kitchen scraps to compost, setting up a worm bin, what kind of bedding materials and whatnot to use, what kind of worms to put in your worm bin, and then some care and maintenance. So what is worm composting? Basically, it's trying to replicate a natural composting process that occurs in nature. Okay, think about a forest. Okay, when you walk through a forest, okay, no one's out there churning everything over and turning things around so that the composting materials are underneath the soil level. Okay, they're on the top of the soil. Okay, and they rot and they compost naturally. And how do those nutrients get down into the soil? Well, different soil organisms, like a worm, carry those nutrients down into the soil where the plant roots are. Okay, and so the plants can thrive. So worms, this is a misnomer. Worms really don't eat your kitchen scraps. They eat the bacteria and the fungi that are growing because the kitchen scraps are decomposing. When you put scraps into a worm bin, okay, fruits and vegetables and nuts and grains, okay, you need to do that in advance and have enough time go by so that they start decomposing before you add the worms, or else the worms won't have anything to eat. Okay. The benefits of having a worm bin are that you're recreating your own recycling process. Okay, you're not discarding anything that is usable. Okay, you're helping plants, providing them with beneficial bacteria and micronutrients. You're saving waste from going to landfalls, which is certainly good. It's an opportunity for education. If you've got kids or grandchildren or even the neighbors, have them over and have them participate. It really is a lot of fun, kind of crazy sounding, a lot of fun raising worms and having worms work with you. Okay, so is it difficult? Not at all. It's very, very easy. As you can see on the scale at the bottom of the slide, okay, it's really easy to set up a system, okay, and upkeep is done maybe twice a week, once a week, however often, okay. Worms are really happiest when they're left alone. Okay, we'll get into that in a little while. So worm bins. You can buy a worm bin or you can build a worm bin. I'm a promoter of saving as much money as you can. And so I go to a big box store or an outlet store and I get a plastic bin. Okay, I'm going to talk about how you prepare that bin. Okay, but the first step is that you have to have something to start with. Okay, a bin. And it has to have adequate ventilation because worms breathe. They breathe through their skin, but they still breathe. They breathe oxygen, just like we do. So you want to have a dark tub, okay? You don't want to have anything clear, okay? Worms are sensitive to light, okay? So the darker it is, the better. So a black tub or a dark blue tub is perfectly fine. And you want to have some ventilation. You can see in this diagram that there are air holes along the top. Okay, some worm bins have air holes down below the bedding material, and that's okay too. Worms will not escape because, like I said earlier, worms are sensitive to light, okay, and they will not leave your worm bin. So don't worry about drilling a whole bunch of holes. The worms will stay in your worm bin. It's not advancing. There we go. Okay, so on the left is a picture of a worm bin someone has purchased. It's a fairly dark material, and they've drilled holes all the way around the top for adequate ventilation. When the composting process happens, it produces odors, okay, and gases that are not necessarily toxic to worms, but they don't like them. So you've got to get a way for those gases to escape the worm bin, and you've got to have a way for oxygen to enter the worm bin. Okay, on the right is a system that you can purchase. Okay, it's a tiered system. I think I have a picture later on of a multi-tiered pit system. But in this system in the green bin, the bins actually sit on top of one another, and the worms are able to migrate once the food is all decomposed and whatnot in the bottom. They can migrate upwards toward the top. Here's a picture of a wooden worm bin. Somebody built this. You can see that it's got hinges down at the very bottom. Okay, that's where they're taking out what we call vermicompost. Okay, worm castings. For those of you who are here, I have some worm castings that you can see. And as you put food, like I said, in the top, okay, the worms will migrate upwards once there's nothing to eat in the bottom, and you can scoop out the bottom of this container, okay, and the food just will cycle, further and further deeper in the worm bin. Okay, so there's a test. Is this a good worm compost system on a kitchen counter? Give you a second to think about it. Okay, seconds up. No, it's not. This is not a compost system. Okay, this is where they're collecting their kitchen scraps. Okay, you can collect your kitchen scraps in practically anything. They're not going to have a bad odor to them. Clean off your kitchen counter, clean off this bucket maybe 2-3 times a week, and you're going to be just fine. My wife was trying to help me, and she did help me. Okay, when we first started setting up and collecting food scraps, I was going online and I was looking at these expensive systems of stainless steel cans with lids and charcoal filters and whatnot, and they cost a lot of money. I mean, oh my gosh. So there's got to be a less expensive way to go. Well, there is. She came home with an ice bucket and said, here you go. Here's an ice bucket. And that's what we still use. It's stainless steel. I clean it out every once in a while, not every time I empty it, but that's where I collect kitchen scraps to go into my worm bins. Just a simple ice bucket, and it was a whole lot less expensive. And I didn't need a filter. I didn't need charcoal. I didn't need all the gizmos and whatnot that retail stores will want to charge you. I talk about worms escaping. They don't have eyes, but their skin is sensitive to light. So they're not going to get away from you, okay? Besides, if a worm tries to get away from you, it can't go very fast. Is it okay to have a worm bin outside? Certainly. A lot of worm bins are touted for in garage use. That's fine. You can have it in your garage. The temperature is fairly regulated in the garage. But you can have it outside. My worm bins are outside. I have 3 worm bins. They are in the shade. One is under the shade of a tree, so it gets a little bit of sun. Okay, the other is under the eaves of my house, and it never gets any sun. It collects water on the top that my dog drinks because I have the lid on it. Okay, but don't worry about it getting too hot or too cold unless it's way, way cold or way, way hot. Worms really don't like it over 90 degrees. When it gets really super hot, what are they going to do? They're going to go to the inside of the worm bin and they're going to hide out. They're going to go, I don't like the outside because it's cold, but it's a nice comfortable temperature on the inside. And if it gets below 40 degrees, you might find your worms migrating inside as well. Okay, but you don't have to worry about them. Even if it's freezing outside, your worm bin is going to be just fine. Okay, so preparing a worm bin. You need a completed something, either a plastic bucket with holes drilled in it, a storage bin, something that you've constructed out of wood, okay? And you have to have bedding materials, okay? And we'll talk about bedding materials in a second. And you always want to put in 1 or 2 handfuls of soil, okay? And I'll get to why the soil in a bit, okay? And then water, okay? Worms, oh, weight is misspelled, oh my gosh. Okay, spell check, fooled me again. Okay, you don't want worms to go without water. They're not drinking it, but they need to be moist. Their skin needs to be moist in order for them to breathe. If it's not moist enough, they will desiccate, they will die, and you'll have to get some more worms. And we'll talk about where you can get worms later in the presentation. Oh, why are we adding soil? Well, we're adding soil. I think I said earlier, worms have gizzards, okay? And so you want fine particulate matter in a gizzard of a worm so that it can grind up some of the food that it's eating, okay? That's why you add soil, okay? Okay. It also provides microbes and bacteria, fungi, and maybe an arthropod or two. I'm not going to get into arthropods. That's a kind of a higher animal life form, okay? But think microbes and bacteria and fungi, okay? Recreating the natural soil environment that you might find outside. Okay, so now we're talking about bedding materials. Remember, you got a bin first, that's step 1. Now step 2 is you've got to get some bedding materials. What I did when I got my first worm bin is I shredded up a whole lot of newspaper. And I was in my family room and I must have got, I had a huge worm bin. My worm bin, my pile of newspaper was probably about 3-4 feet high and about 5 feet wide. And my wife, I got up in the middle of the night and started shredding newspaper. Okay. And my wife came in and she said, what in the heck are you doing? I said, well, I'm getting ready for my worm bin. You don't have to use newspaper, but it's a readily available source. Cardboard works great. Worms love to eat cardboard. Shredded bark, that's fine. Horse manure, as long as it's well composted, not fresh, well composted horse manure. Any of those 4 kinds of things are good bedding materials. Then you want step 3, you want to add some kitchen scraps. Well, okay, fine. What do we add? Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and grains. There's some things that you don't want to add, and that's on another slide. Okay, and you add those kitchen scraps directly to the bedding material. If you want to chop it into small pieces, it makes them decay faster. Okay, if you want to freeze them, it breaks down the cell structure of your fruits and vegetables. Okay, and it'll decay, rot faster. Okay, worms don't have teeth. They slurp their food. Isn't that great? Just like a bowl of soup.
They slurp.
Uncle George slurps his food, right? So do worms. He's in good company.
Uncle George.
Okay. Don't throw these things away. This is just a pictorial of the kinds of things that you want to save. Okay, coffee grounds over on the left. It looks like some leaks on the green material. apple core, eggshells, tea bags, looks like some carrot peelings, and certainly a banana. You know, bananas have a lot of potassium in it. Guess what? Their peels do too. Okay, lots of potassium going into the soil. So don't throw these things away. Put them in some kind of container on your kitchen counter, and once or twice a week, empty it into your worm bin. What do you want to avoid? You want to avoid citrus peels, pineapple, onions. Why? Because they increase acidity. Okay? And worms don't like it. In fact, they're fairly, this acid soil is toxic to worms.
Oh,
So
wow.
avoid those things. Okay. Dairy, milk, cheese, meat, bone skins, these create offensive odors.
They don't
Okay,
like, worms don't like onion.
that, yeah, they don't. That's because it makes them acidic. Okay. You don't want these things because they attract mice and rats. Okay. I actually had a rat living in my wooden worm bin. It ate a hole through the back edge. I didn't know it was in there. I opened the lid. I shuffled things around inside a little bit to bury some kitchen scraps, and something moved. And I thought, what the heck was that? And I looked a little closer, and there was a round hole that was probably about 1.5 inches wide, disappearing into the bedding material. Okay. I looked a little closer, stuck my shovel in there, not my hand, okay, and a rat emerged, shot out the hole in the back, and scurried down off the patio. Okay. So you just trust me, you don't want milk, cheese, meat, things like that. Okay. Oils, butter, salad dressing, mayonnaise, these have fats in them. Okay. And they will create an anaerobic environment, which breeds bacteria, bad bacteria that you don't want. Okay. So just stay away from those things. And pet feces. Oh my gosh, just don't even think about it. Okay. Well, I didn't have time to take a picture of that rat that I found, so I gave you guys a couple of pictures of rats. Look at the little guy on the left. He is particularly ugly. Unwelcome critters, harmful bacteria. Just don't do it. Okay, so step 4. Now we're getting to the good stuff. We're adding red wigglers, but recognize step 3 was adding kitchen scraps. And we're gonna let them stay there for a while until they start decomposing. Okay, you're not gonna add red wigglers right away. Okay, we'll get into what red wigglers are in just a second. Okay, but that's the kind of worm that you want to use in your worm bin. Okay, red wigglers, I said, why? They settle into the new home fairly quickly. Okay, they eat almost all the foods that you're going to put in. Okay, and as adults, they produce babies like crazy. When you add red wigglers, why red wigglers? Okay, I think it's another slide, but let me cover it now just in case. Okay, a lot of people go out in their gardens and they dig up earthworms and they think, oh, great, earthworms, I'll throw that in my worm bin. You don't want an earthworm. It's not going to hurt anything, but it's going to die. Okay, it's not going to do you any good. A red wiggler or a red worm lives on the surface of the soil. It doesn't burrow down into the soil. It eats the decaying matter that are on the top of the soil. An earthworm builds a permanent structure. It can go down as deep as 6 feet. Okay, and it builds a permanent structure under the soil, and that's where it lives. It goes up on the surface to get food, and it takes it right back down into little cavities, okay, where it stores food and then eats them and whatnot. Okay, so an earthworm in a worm bin doesn't have a place to build a home. Okay, and so it's not going to survive. Whereas a red worm that's used to living on the surface of the soil, okay, can live anywhere in your worm bin quite nicely. Okay, one slide on worm sex, because I have to talk to people about it. The picture on the left are 2 worms mating, okay? And each one has ovaries and testes. So that when they mate, okay, they actually produce 2 cocoons, okay? they back away from one another and slide out of the cocoon that they've made. It's a kind of a mucousy sort of thing until it dries. Okay. And each cocoon can have 2 to 3 little worm babies in it. Okay. That are going to mature and then are going to hatch. And then you're going to have more worms. If I go back a slide, look at that last line. As adults, they produce 10 young per week. They reproduce astronomically. You do not have to have a lot of redworms to start with. I'll talk more about that in a later slide. And there's a cocoon. So when you're out in your garden and you move aside some leaves and you find these little round, kind of reddish, tannish things, those are worm cocoons. You don't really know what kind of worm cocoons they are until they hatch. But chances are, if they're on the surface of the soil, you've got redworms. Okay. And I will let you know right now that I have never purchased, well, that's not true. For myself and my own use, I have never purchased any redworms. Okay. All I do is I scoop up some leaf debris and some soil with it, and I put it in my worm box and I waited. And sure enough, I had scooped up some cocoons. I hadn't even seen them. Okay. And I've got, oh, I don't know, saying I have billions of worms is probably an overstatement, but I have millions of worms, very definitely. Like, oh, okay, so I do have a slide here. Why earthworms don't work. Just as a reminder, earthworms build permanent structures, and you don't have a permanent structure in a worm bin. Okay, so how can you tell a red wiggler or a tiger worm? They go by lots of different names. They go by reds. Okay. You see those rings on it? That's a redworm. Okay. And that's an earthworm. No rings. Now I'm going to do an aside. Okay. We have a bad actor in Oregon. It's called a jumping worm. Okay, it's an invasive species. It's an Asian jumping worm, or some people call them crazy snake worms because they bounce around a lot. They can even jump off the ground. Okay, and they've been found in Oregon forests in Clackamas and Josephine counties. It is only a matter of time before they come into our county. Okay, Jackson County, if that's where you are. And the problem with them is that they look like an earthworm. They're a little bit different. I think I have a picture later. Okay. They eat just like a redworm does. They eat the debris on the surface of the soil, okay, rather than taking it down into the soil. Okay. A regular earthworm, the good kind, like I said, they burrow into the soil and they create avenues for food debris and water and air to percolate through the soil. Okay. These worms eat the stuff on the top of the soil. Okay. So that there isn't the material for the regular earthworms, the good earthworms to consume. Okay. And they hurt the forest. Things don't grow quite as well. Well, that's a little tiny picture. Okay. But a jumping worm has a, clitellum, is that how you pronounce it? Okay, that's very, very smooth and there are no ridges on it. Okay, it's kind of a milky white gray colored. And that's how you can tell a jumping worm. You can also hold it and tickle it and it'll just wiggle all over the place. Okay, so we've had steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now we're adding more food scraps. Okay, when you add food scraps, don't add too much. Okay, that first bullet, add scraps sparingly. Okay, that's a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 20:1. We're not talking about a compost bin or anything like that. Okay, which is like a 3:1 ratio or 2:1 ratio. Okay, this is 20:1. So you want bedding material, and we talked about bedding materials earlier. Okay, shredded bark, coir, sawdust, shredded newspaper. Okay, you want by weight. You want 20 more of that than you want kitchen scraps. a good friend of mine, when I was giving a presentation at a garden club locally, a good friend of mine was talking about how they weren't having any success with their worm bin because it was getting gooey and things weren't working right and the worms weren't happy. They weren't living. Okay. And I said, well, what are you doing? Because worms are fairly successful in lots of different environments. And she was just adding lots and lots of kitchen scraps and not worrying about how much bedding material she had. And it was just turned to goo. Worms don't like that. Okay. Remember, if I didn't say it before, I'll say it now. Worms don't eat the kitchen scraps that you're putting in. They eat the microorganisms and the bacteria and the fungi that are part of the decomposition process, okay, that those food scraps and the bedding material provide. If you don't have the right mixture, okay, then you're not providing the right environment for your redworms, okay? Too much food turns things to mush. Worms don't like it. They can't breathe. You want to have lots of oxygen in your bedding material, and there just isn't, okay? You want to bury the scraps 1 to 2 inches below the bedding or deeper. That's okay too. Okay, and keep things moist. Remember I said worms breathe through their skin. Okay, and so you want moisture there, not sogginess. Okay, so carbon. What is carbon? That's the bedding material. We call that the browns. Okay, shredded newspaper, cardboard, peat moss, coir. Oh, by the way, coir, if you don't know what it is, it's shredded coconut husks. Okay, or sawdust. Okay, I've never used sawdust and I don't think I will. It's not easy to manage. Okay, for nitrogen, okay, that's your food scraps. That's the green kitchen scraps. So a ratio of 20 to 1 carbon to nitrogen, that'll do you well. And then you harvest, and it's called vermicompost. It could be called worm poop. That's okay too. Okay, worm castings, that's a nice word to use, worm castings. If you're here in person in the library, I actually, at the end of the presentation, the audience has I have some worm castings they can put their fingers in and run it through their hands and whatnot. It's dry and it's wonderful stuff. It's like little teeny tiny pellets, and they're mostly kind of round. And that's the end result of everything. If you here's an aside, not in the presentation, if you let a worm bin go, you get it all set up, you put the bedding material in, you put the kitchen scraps in, you put your redworms in, you close it up, and you go on vacation. A year later, you come back and go, oh, wait, that's a long vacation, isn't it? You come back, you haven't done anything. What's going to happen? Well, with the right kind of environment, if it's moist enough, okay, those worms are going to live and they're going to die and they're going to produce babies and they're going to live and they're going to eat and they're going to die. And pretty soon they're going to run out of food. So they start eating one another. Okay, and then they die and they desiccate, whatever. And so when you come back, you open the lid and all you're going to find is what is in this picture. Okay, you're not going to see any food. You're not going to see any bedding material. All you're going to see is worm castings. Okay, and that's from living and dying and whatnot in a closed environment. Okay, with no extra help on our part. Okay. Okay. Well, there it is. It's not an aside, it's that first bullet. All that you're going to see is left is worm castings, no worms, if you don't do anything at all. Okay. What I do is I clean out my worm bins on a regular basis. Okay. And regular basis is like once a year. Okay. And I spread it out on some clean plastic tarp. Okay. And if you make a mound, the worms are all going to go. Remember I said they're sensitive to light. Okay. They're going to go to the inside of the pile. So you scrape off the outside of the pile. Okay. And then you put that aside, put it in your garden, do whatever. Okay. And any worms that were exposed are going to say, I don't like it here. This is nuts. He keeps taking off the outside. I'm going to go deeper and deeper and deeper. And so you keep doing that. You take off the outside, they go deeper. You take off that outside, you go deeper. And pretty soon you're left with just a great big ball of worms. Well, maybe not exactly only worms, but they're going to go to the center of the pile. Okay. And that's the way you can harvest vermicompost very, very easily. Okay, it's a soil amendment. It's not soil itself, this vermicompost, and it's not a fertilizer. So don't think that you can just add this to your garden and everything is good, because it's not. What vermicompost does add is all kinds of beneficial bacteria and micronutrients. Okay. Think about the inside of a worm for a moment. There's all kinds of bacteria, just like people, bacteria that are living in the gut of a worm. And that can't help but go all the way through and be deposited at the anterior end of the posterior end of the worm when it poops. Okay. It's a beneficial soil amendment, but it's not fertilizer. Okay, so throw away the leachate. Okay, two pictures. The one on the left is compost tea. The one on the right is leachate. Look at, there's a spigot. That's a worm bin, that plastic, that's a yellow, or not yellow, it's an orange plastic bin with a spigot on the end of it and some very dark liquid that looks like it's coming out of that spigot. That's called leachate. Okay, that's the liquid, okay, that is naturally produced out of a worm bin, okay, and you want to throw it away. So if you've got a neighbor you don't like, put it in their trash, okay, but don't put it on your plants, okay. Compost tea is something very, very different, okay. I'll get to compost tea in a second, okay. So here's a diagram. What's wrong with this diagram? I just got saying that leachate is what comes out the bottom of this worm bin process, okay, not worm tea. And here's a picture that says it's worm tea. Well, it's not, okay. Whatever comes out the bottom of your worm bin, throw it away, okay. That's not how compost tea or worm tea is made. Okay, so how do you make worm tea? It's really, really easy. You take the contents of your worm bin, okay, the bottom of the worm bin where the worms have been most active, okay, where there's vermicompost, worm poop, okay, and you put it in a bag, okay, and then you soak it in some water. Now, what do you do with the contents of the bag once it's soaked? Put it back in your worm bin. It's perfectly good stuff. It's just that all those worm tea nutrients have been leached out and is now in your water, and you can now spread those. You can spray it on the leaves of your plants if you want. Okay. If you want to make worm tea, okay, you can go to an elaborate process. Okay, you can put that material into like an aquarium. Think of an aquarium. Okay, you put the contents of the worm bin, okay, that's been thoroughly gone through with the worms, okay, and then you put up an air pump, okay, and you pump air or oxygen through that mixture, okay, and that's what stimulates the microbial activity, okay, is the oxygen, because you want an oxygen-rich environment, and you do that for a while, and then all that good stuff becomes worm tea. So where do you get worms? Okay. Well, what I did, I scraped up some healthy soil, okay, and I put it in my worm bin, and I said, okay, let's just see what happens. And I got lots and lots of worm bins, and they've been, remember, okay, multiplying like crazy. Okay, I give red worms away to my neighbors. Okay, you can go to a local seller. There is a woman who goes to the crafters markets here locally, okay, who sells vermicompost, and she sells worms as well. I don't think she sells any worm tea. Okay, you can also go. There's a worm farm in Talent. It's called Rogue Worms. You can go online. It's called rogueworms.com. Okay, and they sell vermicompost, worm tea, worms. Never been over there, but I know people who have been and say it's a good place to go. And I have purchased worms one time. I sent worms to my son. He lives in Utah. Okay, so not very convenient for me just to drive there and give him some red worms. So I ordered some online. Okay, and I went to Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, and I just like the name. Okay, and I ordered way too many worms, and he got them all. And, you know, he's none the wiser of having too many worms, but I could have ordered half or a quarter as much as I ordered. Okay. And they would have just multiplied in his worm bins and done just fine. Okay. The best book on the market, and I have several books here. In fact, let me see how this works. I'm holding up a book. Oh, it's not in focus. Well, that's not good. Well, the name of this book is Worm Farming. Okay. Don't pay any attention to it. There's another book there called The Worm Farming Revolution. Geez, I wish you could see this. Why isn't it coming through? Because I'm what? What do you mean highlighted? Okay, anyway, okay, all right. Okay, the best book on the market is what you see on the screen. Worms Eat My Garbage. Okay, it is written so that anybody can understand it. It's written by a lady named Mary Applehoff. This particular version, which is the latest version, okay, is the 35th anniversary version. This book's been around for a long time. Okay, and it's excellent. It will tell you everything you need to know about setting up a worm bin and how to maintain it. Excellent book. I have a worm bin. Okay, and it's a double. Okay, I have two worm, two buckets, and they're exactly the same, okay, except for one thing. In the bottom of the first one, okay, I have some cylinders, and you could put bricks in here. This is not magic. Okay, but what that does is that when I put the second bin in on top of it, it doesn't go all the way to the bottom. And what I have on the bottom is a spigot, that white spigot. Well, guess what? They clog. So it's not that good an idea, but I thought it was a wonderful thing at the start. Okay, and if it doesn't clog, you can get rid of the leachate, which you don't want, which you're gonna, put in a bottle and you're gonna give to your neighbor. Okay, and it's a very dark plastic material. Okay, if you can see how this opens, this is a garage box. Okay, why is it a garage box? Because if any water from rain drops on this, it's going to go right inside your worm bin, and you don't want that. Now here's an outside version. Okay, and it's got a solid lid. Okay, solid lid, no holes in it. So when it rains, okay, the rainwater, and it's full of newspaper. Okay, this is the bedding material. Okay. And again, this is two bins, okay, one inside another. Okay, a little bit different system. I put some. You can use anything. Like I said, you can use bricks or whatnot. I just use some light plastic rings, and I put them in the bottom. There's no spigot on the outside of this. Okay, so this is going to collect leachate. I have holes in the bottom. I hope I have holes in the bottom. Yep, I have holes in the bottom of the top bin. Okay, so when I put it down in here, the bottom bin doesn't go all the way to the bottom. The bottom bin is going to collect the leachate. Okay, and I've drilled holes around the top. Okay, for ventilation. Okay, so the bad gases from the decomposition process, they're going to leave. Okay, and oxygen's going to get in, and the worm's going to be very happy. And again, like I said, I have a solid top. So, and this is an example of an outside bin. Okay, I have one like this that fills with rainwater, and my dog likes to drink from it. And then I have another example. Okay, and again, this doesn't have a spigot, but it's got air holes. And you see those white pipes on the bottom? Those come in from the side, okay, and provide air to the bottom of the worm bin, which is just fine. And then the top also has vents providing air to the top. Okay, so when I close it up, I've got air at the bottom and air at the top, and no way for it to collect leachate. It's just going to pile up, and so you have to kind of scooch things to the side and get rid of it. But that's not a hard thing to do. I have worm castings. Okay. And people who are here can, It's dry, okay, it's not wet, and it's just a fine powdery material, and they're like little round balls, okay, and this is what comes out the back end of a worm, okay, so the library told me they just put in new carpet, so I need to be careful not to spill anything on the floor. And there's red worms. Don't know if you can see those or not. Those are red worms. That one's named George. That's Hazel. No, they don't have names. I'm not that into worms. I haven't named all these. Besides, like I said, I have millions of worms. I couldn't possibly remember all their names. But isn't that fun? You can see them wiggling, and it's not a jumping worm because it's not jumping, but it's just wiggling around, and they probably don't like it because why? Why wouldn't worms like it? Because they're sensitive to light. Exactly. Okay, and this is very moist and very gooey, and I have something to wipe my fingers on. So now you know everything that you needed to know about worm composting. Okay, you can go off and you can set something up for yourself. Reminder, when you set up, if it's a plastic bin, get a dark plastic bin. You don't want a clear thing. You don't want a really light color. You want a dark color. You want black or a dark blue, okay, because the worms are sensitive to light. The easiest thing to do is to shred some newspaper. When I moved to Medford, I asked the Mail Tribune whether they used soy-based ink in their newspaper, because you don't want regular printer's ink because the worms don't like it. And you certainly don't want any colored ink. Okay. Well, they didn't get back to me. And they didn't get back to me. And a week went by and 2 weeks went by, and I thought they've forgotten all about me. So I called and I asked again. I said, I talked to somebody, because I didn't remember their name. I talked to somebody and I asked them about, what kind of printer's ink they used, because I was setting up a worm bin and I didn't want to, use regular printer's ink. And they said, "Oh, I'm the person you talked to." And I said, "Well, what's the answer?" They said, "Well, I went to the print shop and they don't know." And I thought, how can that possibly be that the print shop in a newspaper doesn't know whether they're using soy-based ink or not? Amazing. Nonetheless, I've been using Mail Tribune newspaper for years, and my worms are healthy. So it must be okay. 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 One other thing for those people who are online. Okay. I want to give you my email address. If you have questions about worm bins or worms in general, okay, you can email me. Okay. It's John Kobal, my name, no spaces, JOHN KO, B as in boy, AL, at yahoo.com. So John Kobal at yahoo.com. You don't have the advantage of the people here in this who are in person. Okay. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to ask me questions later, or send me pictures or whatever. Okay. Feel free. Okay. I am a Master Gardener. Okay. From the Oregon State University Extension here in Jackson County. And it's my responsibility to educate the public. And so since you're part of our public, I hope you're being educated.